The theme of the series is to disrupt some of the certainty that I observe people having around these topics, but with the purpose of gaining clarity. So oftentimes we need to dissect a little bit and parse out some of the things that we think we know or have a little bit too much certainty around to see if we can actually get some more clarity. So speed versus efficiency, we're putting pressure on our value of efficiency and what is actually efficient. And in our culture, we have a very strong conditioned value that speed equals efficiency. Even though intellectually, I think many smart people, leaders, executives will admit that speed isn't always efficient, it's still a deep conditioning in our corporate culture and also in our society. And so this is what we want to bring a little bit more expansive considerations to what is actually efficient and what does speed often cost us.
For example, is having a cold and kind of rushing the process of healing, or any illness or injury where we rush the process. And what it costs us is that we don't truly heal and we end up staying sick for longer or not healing properly.
Part of the, I would say, obsession, addiction to speed that we have as a culture is because it feels good. It feels good to do things fast, to see things fast, to experience yourself making decisions quickly, right? It feels good and it feels powerful even. And yet the costs are often hidden, as you just described. I mean, healing is a perfect one. Trying to rush one's healing usually does not work well. And there's places where patience is fundamentally not only required, but the most efficient path. And so that's what we're kind of addressing. And I want to up top say that obviously speed is good, and particularly where it's good is in emergencies. So cardiac arrest, in wildfires, cyber attacks, right? We need speed because any loss of time creates a huge problem, one death or destruction, right? So speed is important in certain situations. But what we see is a concern is how that's over indexed. And it's become a value that is equivocated to efficiency. And in our observations and the work that we do, and in human decision and intelligence, we find a lot of bad decisions are made by the prioritization of speed.
We need speed, especially for cardiac arrest and wildfires. But I do think the wildfire example is a way that we could think about responding even to an emergency situation, and how speed alone doesn't necessarily equal efficiency. And there's counterintuitive ways to approach stopping the wildfire from spreading that seem inefficient and actually create efficiency. What conditions must exist for speed to have an interplay with efficiency, or vice versa?
This isn't a binary conversation. It never is. Human decision intelligence is always about including and adding more of the variables that are present, but either ignored or not seen. So we're here to say speed is awesome if we can get to comprehension, and if we can get to integration quickly, great. Just typically there are places where speed is substituting something like competence or comprehension, because certain values around culture, cognition, for example, can't be created quickly. They require time. It requires an evaluation, and it requires a kind of processing in order to integrate that into a group of people or into individual brains. Like, that is rarely immediate or quick. But if in more practice, we can become people who are quicker to process information and to integrate that into our cultures and relationships, great, awesome, nothing wrong with that. That's even better.
I'm thinking about how efficient it is to sit with the problem a little bit longer and understand the problem. And then also where you're responding in a more strategic way. And so this also starts to hover over the line of reaction versus response too. That's another distinction.
Examples like, executive war room strategies, right? There's this forcing of a rapid consensus. And anytime we are forcing speed without processing, we mask certain elements. So that's the question. What is speed potentially masking here? What kind of uncertainties, particularly around consensus, when you're really forcing consensus, what are people missing, or what are people not dealing with in terms of uncertainties of, I don't know, supply chain or regulatory issues or customer issues? What are those places of more complex uncertainty that aren't being dealt with as a result of forcing this kind of consensus and speed? So I think this is something that's really important to examine, is what is necessary here, what's preferred, what is a substitution that somehow makes us feel like we're doing our job because we're engaging in some immediate and powerful activation.
Yeah, not speed for the sake of speed as a default mechanism, but to take it based on context and have the skills, mastery, awareness in order to choose speed in moments that are necessary, or even in specific phases of projects where you can move more quickly on some, less quickly on others. Like Amazon's decision making policy is like, if you can easily walk back the decision, you make the decision quickly. If you can't easily walk it back, you take more time with it. Another thing that comes to mind is the idea of sleeping on it.
Neuroscience teaches us how important sleep is. And so another example is like these certain creative sprints that are bypassing a kind of mind wandering and a kind of lingering, or we talk about liminal spaces where so much of our imagination and creativity ends up taking form. And if you're pushing things quickly and pushing people to stay up later, what sleep is a huge important piece of this, to where all of this kind of pressure ends up in the creative process, often ends up producing cliches or kind of sophomoric ideas, right? That are more surface. We need time.
I also want to make sure we're defining efficiency, or defining it in the context of how we think about efficiency from a decision making perspective.
Efficiency is a complex evaluation, because what are the metrics that we're defining efficiency to contain? Like you said earlier, what are the conditions that we decide something is efficient? And speed can be one of them, right? Like we're not saying that speed shouldn't be a part of the equation. How easily are we able to reverse a decision? Are we recognizing the short term versus the long term effects? If something we're thinking is very efficient in the short term, but actually is inefficient long term, well, now it's no longer efficient unless the parameters are very specific to, okay, for the next 2 weeks, we're trying to make a quick decision just for these 2 weeks. Well, okay, then we have created parameters and conditions for that level of efficiency, but without taking into account a long term potential.
Like
It's
closing a bunch of shitty deals at the end of a quarter and then paying for it in customer support time and effort down the
100%. Like that becomes incredibly costly and very inefficient. So,
yeah.
where are we hiding behind our parameters of efficiency that tend to lean on speed? And that's the attention that we're bringing here. Is oftentimes we found in, working with as many clients and people as we have, that there's this over dependency, reliance, value for speed where so much inefficiency is actually occurring. Let's look at this again. Like, let's really bring it into our attention in ways that we all can intellectually agree how
Yeah.
efficiency is not tied to speed. And yet we continually go to speed. Why is that? How can we do it differently? What could we include that actually is more efficient?
Yeah, we keep using speed as the recipe to lead us to efficiency. And we use speed in lieu of other tools, comprehensive evaluation of the problem, the time to spend lingering so we can come up with new creative ideas. And so we just want to elevate some of the other ingredients present in creating an efficient strategy or making an efficient decision.
Yeah, a lot of this happens in our data driven obsessions to make decisions, all these micrometrics and all of these data points from which we can feel we can make quick decisions, but they're often knee jerk decisions that aren't taking into account long term trends, because that's not what's popping up on our dashboards. And so what we have to wait to receive is longer trends. And how do we recognize longer trends outside of time?
Maybe a customer who's used a product over a year versus what the first few weeks are saying.
Yeah, and I would say one of the root causes, or a couple root causes, of what is behind this commitment to speed, I would speak for myself, is impatience and stress. So if I'm stressed out, and I'll use a personal example now, but this also happens in most communications, business or personal, that something is going wrong, something isn't right, there's been some miscommunication or something. And in my impatience and my stress, or for some people, anxiety, or some instances, anxiety, I want to solve this right away in order to get rid of my anxiety and so that I don't have to use energy to wait. So if one doesn't have a developed skill around patience, which I have struggled with, then there is this urge to be immediate, to immediately take care of something because then I can get it off my plate. Again, that is a false signal of efficiency. And I can relieve myself of this point of anxiety or stress and I can feel good about it, right? Because it's an immediate execution. And then what happens in my instance, it usually happens in communication that I'm trying to correct something and I will communicate too quickly without taking the time and a pause or waiting to really allow the situation to form in my own mind. And often, by the way, in our own hearts, like our emotional clocks and our emotional processing needs time just as much as our mind. And how humans experience and metabolize and assimilate information and data is really important to how we act as a result of that processing. So without time to think about and process or to feel it out and process, we generally don't make the greatest decisions. So in human decision intelligence, again, there is so much practice and skill around patience and pausing in order to collect data, in order to zoom out or zoom in for perspective. And then, perhaps most importantly, is to process that data and information mentally, emotionally, relationally. And I mean relationally, not just between each other, but between systems. So, human decision intelligence is very much about taking the time to process and gaining skills around that processing. I have done this over and over where I'm communicating too quickly and I'm missing shit. And in that lack of visibility and lack of processing, I've just created a worse problem for myself. and and it's been incredibly inefficient. So all that like feel good around, oh, I'm going to take care of this immediately, get it off my plate, like mentally and emotionally, I can feel better about this. And yet, man, I just made it worse. So now I have to spend double, triple the time correcting for that. And I think this is very, very human, by the way, but it's a daily point of our humanity that we want to bring attention to show how deeply conditioned this behavior is that really causes so much inefficiency in our personal and professional lives.
I like when I'm talking with someone and maybe I'm presenting information and asking for some kind of decision to be made to introduce waiting and ask them to sit with it and let me know later. And that way I get a response that's well thought out and it's one that we can keep working forward with versus getting a response that may or may not actually be their final answer and then creating more work because now we have to revisit it as they think on it and maybe new objections or new questions or different perspectives come up that they didn't have when they were making a decision in the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, being thoughtful requires a beat, requires a pause. And that is something that we have not valued, I think, culturally and even relationally, that when we feel strong or powerful, it's usually inside some immediacy versus some pause. We're like, well, let me think about that. Let me process that and really, get to some nuances or get to some feelings or getting to new data, right? And emotional data is data that's incredibly beneficial to our physical, tangible data in terms of decision making. And if we don't give time to collect not just the tangible, obvious data that is directly related to the problem, to dig a little deeper and discover what other information might be underneath that will help us figure out what's most efficient and where things are going to be benefited from speed or where we need to take a little bit of extra time.
For me, the extra little bit of time helps me identify patterns in my decision making, like kind of impulsive or maybe more of like the reaction versus the response. And it also then helps to illuminate blind spots. And so this is where we can really unlodge ourselves from pattern decision making where it's less conscious and we're in more of a default. And so we can address our blind spots. I'm also very interested in where speed does lead to efficiency. So, like, one example that came to mind was SpaceX. And maybe that's a little bit of a touchy subject because there's so many tangential perspectives on that company. But we've talked previously about how they just fucking launch rockets. And it's like in the speed that gets more data, which ends up creating kind of an overall more efficient. Does it cost more? Absolutely, in time, resources, but they're intentionally going about it in a way to use failure to collect data and bring that into efficient process versus waiting to have kind of the perfect product before they start trying it. So what's your perspective on that?
I think that this, again, isn't a binary and this isn't so clear. I would say overall that this fail fast idea is bullshit because in certain context, iterations are very expensive and are forcing premature builds that create false shortcuts and that end up being detrimental and defective in scale when we scale something in terms of design and in terms of scaling products. Now, if we're talking about variables and conditions, if there is an intentionality around failure where we're intentionally trying to put pressure on this system so that it fails, so that we can gather information and make it better. And this is a part of the inherent strategy, yes, but overall to have this prescriptive condition and prescriptive value of like fail fast, it's better. It's generally not. Isolating a particular product or a specific system and pushing that intentionally to points of failure can be very intelligent. And that is different than a whole company. Like, let's just load this whole thing up and then see how far we can push it and see if the whole thing fails. There's something about, failing quickly that is intelligent, but how that's executed, how that's managed is the point of this conversation. It shouldn't just be an algorithm and a prescription. It should be something that like, hey, let's think about this. What are we actually pushing here? What are our particular points of failure? How many points of failure can we handle in a way that is least costly? What is helpful to fail in terms of receiving information and data that can be really useful? What do we need to delay and actually hold this framework and the structure so that we can continue to gather data, right? This is a complex problem, obviously. And we don't see founders and executives necessarily holding all of these variables in their mind. Now, on one hand, they're allowing their leaders in their areas of expertise or in their organizations to deal with the particular issues that are inside a certain org. But it's a value problem. It's a scope problem. It's a targeting problem. It's a processing problem. And I think we need to bring a lot more attention to it.
I mean, one of my first inclinations was to say, like, oh, okay, so we can reverse engineer this process to think about, like, where do we need more information? What parts of code or product do we want to stress test? And how can we accelerate speed to intentionally decide these are areas where we want more intel? And so we're going to push it a little bit quicker in order to get that information. But the exact same question could lead to the opposite response, which is we want to get more information. And so, where can we slow down and think and pause and iterate and bring in other subject matter experts in order to get that information before we move? So, again, we land so many times in these conversations, and the answer is both and, depending on fill in the blank. It's context, it's nuance. So how do we develop the skill of noticing which approach or the combination of approaches is going to be useful?
Well, I think one, you're exactly right. It's never just one answer. It depends is the answer. And so the question that we bring in terms of human decision intelligence is where are the places where there are such fixed heuristics, shortcuts, algorithms, social conditioning or cultural conditioning where there isn't enough attention or evaluation or a certain competency, that there are gaps in that intelligence because the conditioning and the heuristics are not accurate enough. So that's the first place we start is we look at, okay, where are we conditioned and biased and where is that helping us and where is it hurting us? The reason why we're bringing it up is because I think it's something that isn't questioned, that generally speed is the go-to. And that's what we're evaluating. It's not that is speed bad. It's that where are we overusing it and misusing it to where we're losing intelligence and we're creating a worse problem and where it's actually deeply inefficient. That's the question.
I've seen sprints, which, like coding sprints for product development in a tech environment. I've seen sprints which are deliberately designed to release bug fixes and product enhancements in a speedy fashion. So there isn't a lot of latency. And so they'd probably be like a couple week sprints. And I see there's really positive things about that. And I also see where maybe there's projects introduced within the sprint that are unreasonable. And then there's a huge cost. Like either the work kind of gets unstable, shoddy, it creates more problems, more bugs. It isn't thoroughly QA'd and tested. And so it can actually crash other systems. So that can create worse problems that you're introducing new bugs, but you also have an additional cost of burnout for engineers.
Sometimes speed is efficient and sometimes it is absolutely not. And I think that the majority of people can intellectually agree with that statement and yet are not realizing the habit and the compulsiveness towards speed. And I think what's underlying that is we use speed as a way to solve our anxiety. If we can fix it quickly, we get it off our plate. But then we miss that it's not actually being fixed. And therefore, we have created a worse problem for ourselves and over time are increasing the stress and anxiety. It just goes dark for a bit. And then also the lack of cultural patience, which I think is around this machine driven world. We are being increasingly conditioned towards speed because of the amount of data and information and resources that we have that are so immediately available to us. And we're not doing the mental practices of processing that data information, sorting that data information, curating that even in our decisions. We have to curate what kind of information we have and then which ones are we using and how are we going to employ all of that information and data. And that requires a different kind of intelligence and skill that usually takes time. And also, we want to consider that in terms of human systems, that most people are able to be pretty fast in their domains of expertise because it's practiced, because they have a skill that's practiced around this kind of information and these particular problems that are within their expertise. But most of us are not making decisions exclusively in our areas of expertise. We're owning our system and our domain, but it's most often interfacing with some other system or some other person to fix and solve or implement. So as soon as we start engaging with other individuals and we interface or intersect with other systems, well, now it's become a little bit more complex. And yeah, we technically have our boards, where people come together and everybody provides input on what they would do and their contribution to solving the problem. But oftentimes, when it's done too quickly, we have the same things that we talked about earlier in the episode, where you're forcing consensus or you're creating some protocol too quickly that's bypassing certain uncertainties or gaps or risk factors that can't so quickly be identified, never mind addressed.
You're starting to kind of hint at where human decision intelligence builds a lot of the skills and tools that we as a collective need to engage some of the more complex problems. The problems or areas to solve are compounding in creating new problems to solve. And that's what's really special about human decision intelligence is how it bridges not just interdisciplinary, but interdomain.
If we're zooming out, thinking through what will be increasingly efficient in our future in relationship to decision making. And it will, in my estimation, require interdomain expertise, not just interdiscipline. And what that means is we're going to have to learn from others in completely different domains as we're in order to apply similar principles. So, for example, physics and poetry, how do those things apply to corporate structures or to coding? And they do in ways that are completely surprising and unsurprising at the same time. The idea is that in our current machine driven world, there is decision fatigue, that our problems are getting a little bit more complicated and our anxiety is increasing and our stress, which also adds complication. How does one navigate a world in which there's so much more information? Our problems are increasingly more complex. Our emotional states are also increasingly more complex. And we have less mental and emotional energy to sort out and navigate and actually process the problems in front of us. This is the reality. This is the problem. And we offer a pedagogy to think through and develop some of these skills so that it becomes easier, and that eventually, when we develop skill and capacity, things become simplified. Anything is easy when we know how to do it. Rocket science is easy for rocket scientists.
And by building skills and decision making, then many areas of your life become simplified, or you can approach them with more ease because decision making is across relationships and work and all of life.
And also, skills and capacity actually increase efficiency. The more we individually and collectively have increased skills and capacity, that fundamentally is efficient, because it's like a body, right? The more muscular a body is, it becomes more efficient in running or lifting because it is strong and agile and flexible. So there's a lot less energy required of a body who's fit to do the very same things as an unfit body. It requires more energy, more risk, and therefore way less efficient. So this is what we're proposing is, hey, this isn't easy. But once these skills and capacities are built, the payoff is an ease and a greater efficiency. And there is a path to that, but not without work, not without growth.
I think of it like a contractor and a toolbox. And there's nothing worse than your contractor showing up every day and needing to go back to the truck 3 times for different tools and then run to Home Depot to buy some new tools and some new supplies. And it's just so much more efficient to show up with a toolbox full of all the tools that you might need for a project, as well as all of the supplies you need so that you can address any issue that comes up. That's my metaphor. How can we look into the future and evaluate some of the costs of today's decisions in terms of how they could lead to inefficiencies?
We're currently building the future with whatever we're doing right now. So even in terms of being a parent, whatever you're teaching your child right now is who they are going to become in the future, right? But worse, usually, sometimes better. But either way, we're actively building the future right now. So what habits and conditions and frameworks and perspectives and values are we doing right now? And what are those going to form in the future? That is not hidden to us. We know that if we are overly valuing speed, then what is the cost of that? We've just talked about it. If we overvalue certain rules that end up creating gaps or atrophying parts of our humanity or parts of the systems that we're trying to build, we can predict that outcome. These aren't far from us. And this is what we're trying to do in human decision intelligence, is think about these things in a different way. Most people are considering these things on some level, and any leader in a company is certainly considering these things. But it's what ways can we think about them differently and evaluate them within a greater scope of intelligence that isn't just what we've learned or just what we're observing.
Perhaps we can look to the places where we keep hitting some conflicts or where we keep returning to certain problems to notice if we haven't solved them in an efficient manner. I thought it was off my plate, and then that person called me and we were back at the beginning, but now we had all this relational scar tissue.
So the first place is to question some of our values and to bring curiosity and less certainty. And when that occurs, then you can start asking the questions like, why do I feel pressured around this? What is the expectation that I am placing on myself or that has been placed on me that doesn't match reality? And what I mean by reality is that there are expectations that we have agreed to or that we're creating that doesn't actually match the facts. And I'm not just saying the facts that are presented to us on a spreadsheet. That's actually the problem, is that our culture has identified and limited and reduced the facts to a spreadsheet. And that's what's actually not accurate. There are way more facts surrounding a problem or a circumstance or any system that's outside a spreadsheet. How can we be more attentive to gathering that information, at least asking the question? And then how much our anxiety is playing a part. This is the huge key human factor that is ever present, is the stress and the anxiety that we feel inside our decision making. And that is 100% related to the expectations that I just said, either placed on us or placed on ourselves. So to really become something different, we start by becoming curious around our values and our habits and our expectations on ourselves and each other. That's the first place. To really be clear on this, speed can sometimes be incredibly efficient. And the question mark here is inside our conditioning around speed, how important that is to us as a culture and how deeply that's been conditioned into us individually. This is why we're questioning it. Where do we use speed and where do we slow down, both personally and inside our decision makings within specific systems? When we get to a place where we have such mastery over ourselves, over the information, over the systems that we're trying to address, where there is more inherent speed. But the place to begin is to first go through that process without having the inflexible demand of speed.
Yeah, that's been my process exploring a new city where I can learn the routes. This is what you're talking about, is having enough mastery of exploring all the different routes of which are the quickest, which are the most scenic, and then how can I integrate the two so that I can actually have a great experience in a timely fashion. But the real invitation is the invitation to make a conscious choice and to not just be guided by speed alone, but instead notice and discern the moments where the context requires whatever dose of speed you want to give the decision making process compared to how you can leverage patience and waiting to aid a more efficient overall process.
Yeah, and examining where one might be using speed to substitute comprehension or culture or any other value. That is a big theme of our work. There's substitutions. We have another episode on that. That is an important inquiry as well, is when are we using speed to substitute for something else, to relieve our anxiety, be able to get more money or to buy us more time. And we know this intuitively. We even know this intellectually. We don't even need our intuition. People understand this, leaders understand this. So it's just how can we break some of these habits so that we're not so freshmen in our processing? Where are these heuristics less intelligent in a way that we need to include more? That is our whole point of our work, is to be able to develop contextual heuristics that change depending on the circumstance and depending on the individuals executing.
I've even seen speed used as a scapegoat to hide behind. So you used the word masked earlier. So what is speed masking? And I've seen people under true pressure to make decisions that didn't hold up and didn't stand the test of time. And then they can hide behind the pressure of the immediate circumstances that made them make that decision instead of owning the decision and owning the decision making process.
So much of decision making these days is an overwhelming human brain issue. The way through it is to gain more skills and mastery, that there are no viable options to become less intelligent in our decision making, because that increases our suffering and increases the burnout, increases the overwhelm. So it's like in certain landscapes, like in terms of our literal environment, we have to have a strong body to survive. We have to develop our lung capacity. We have to develop our muscles in order to survive. So here we are, right? That our environment and our world now demands a particular strength of decision making in order to have a fulfillment, to have satisfaction, and to have less suffering. And so there's not many other options. So sometimes people can get overwhelmed by these conversations because of how it doesn't seem simple, even though it is. It's just getting in the gym. The gym is simple. You just got to get in the gym and do it. And so we're here to help. And we get that it's not fun all the time until it is, until you have a strong, fit body and you're like, yeah, I'm fucking badass. Let's do this. Right. Then it's fun. So how do we get there? And I think that as a people and as a society, we've got a lot of work to do.